Imagine being a child, no older than 6 years, sold not to save your life, but because the very people who should love you most saw you as a problem, a burden, even a shame. For Moses Roer, this wasn't just a nightmare imagined in the dark. It was his brutal reality. Disclaimer: this video contains graphic historical content, including descriptions of violence, oppression, and systemic cruelty rooted in slavery and racism. It is intended for mature audiences only. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. The purpose of this content is educational and historical, to uncover the buried truths of Black history that have been distorted, whitewashed, or completely erased from mainstream narratives. This documentary is not fiction. It is grounded in real testimonies, historical records, and documented atrocities that were once normalized by law and society. We do not glorify violence, nor do we seek to re-traumatize. We seek to inform, honor the victims, and challenge silence. If you are uncomfortable, ask yourself, why is the truth more disturbing than the silence that hides it? To those who say this is too much, remember, the pain wasn't too much for the people who lived it. It was their daily reality. We refuse to sanitize history to make others comfortable, because healing can only begin when truth is acknowledged. If you're here to learn, to unlearn, and to remember, you are in the right place. Moses was born into the cruel world of American slavery in South Carolina, a place where humanity was measured in chains and whips, and where a child's skin tone could seal their fate before they even learned to walk. But Moses' story carries a painful twist. He was sold by his own father, not for kindness or protection, but because Moses' lighter skin embarrassed him. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. The cruel system of slavery created divisions, even within families, and colorism, prejudice against darker skin tones within Black communities, was weaponized by enslavers and sometimes internalized by enslaved people themselves. To some enslaved parents, lighter skin could mean a higher price at auction or favor with white owners, but it could also mean jealousy, fear, and brutal rejection. South Carolina in the early 1800s was a harsh landscape. The rich, fertile land was covered with vast cotton plantations, fields that stretched endlessly under the blazing sun, worked by enslaved men, women, and children. Cotton was king, a crop so valuable it shaped economies and the brutal policies of the American South. The enslaved people toiled from before dawn to dusk, their backs bent under the whip's lash, and their spirits crushed beneath the weight of a system designed to deny them everything: freedom, dignity, family, and sometimes even identity. Names were often stripped away, replaced by numbers or the names of owners. Families were split and sold, with no say in their fate. Moses Roer entered this world as a child born into bondage. His very existence was a commodity. Moses' father was a man enslaved on the same plantation, someone who, under unimaginable pressure and despair, chose to sell his own son. This act, incomprehensible to many today, was shaped by the vicious realities of the time. Survival often meant making impossible decisions, and colorism cut deep even within enslaved families. Moses' lighter skin was seen as a mark of difference, something that his father believed would bring shame or trouble. It's hard to know the full reasons. Was it fear of punishment? A misguided hope that Moses would find a better life? Or something more cruel? A reflection of the twisted values forced upon enslaved people? Whatever the cause, the sale tore the boy from all he knew: his family, his community, his fragile childhood. Moses was sold to John Goo, a ruthless cotton planter whose name would become synonymous with terror in Moses' life. Goo was a man who ruled his plantation with an iron fist, his authority enforced by chains, whips, and a dark cruelty that few dared to challenge. To Goo, Moses was just another slave, a tool to be broken, a soul to be crushed. But Moses' spirit was different. Even at 6 years old, the boy was defiant, a flicker of resistance that would spark the unimaginable courage to come. The sale itself was cold and transactional, a business deal wrapped in the veneer of property exchange. There was no kindness, no recognition of Moses as a child, just the finality of a price and a new owner. Childhood for enslaved children was a shadow of what it was for white children of the time. While others played and learned, Enslaved children faced the brutal reality of forced labor and constant fear. Many were separated from their mothers early, sent to work in the fields or as house servants. Education was forbidden. Punishment was swift and often violent. To speak out of turn, to fall behind, or even a cry could result in cruel discipline. For Moses, the trauma began immediately. From the moment he arrived at Gu's plantation, he was met not with care or protection, but with cruelty meant to break him. One day, after walking miles to attend church, a rare moment of spiritual refuge for enslaved people, Moses returned to the plantation, exhausted but hopeful. Instead of kindness, he met a horror that would scar him for life. John Gu poured tar over Moses' head and set it ablaze. Imagine the searing pain as the flames licked Moses' face, the smell of burning flesh filling the air. His screams echoed across the fields, but there was no mercy. The fire consumed nearly all his hair, leaving scars that marked him forever. This act wasn't just punishment. It was a message to Moses and everyone who watched that defiance would be met with merciless cruelty. Torture device. When Moses tried to run again, Gu bent heavy iron bars around his feet, shackled him, and suspended him by his wrists in the cotton screw. The device squeezed the body painfully, cutting off circulation, twisting limbs, and inflicting agony that was both physical and psychological. Imagine the horror of being trapped, unable to move, every muscle screaming in pain, your body stretched and crushed by cold iron. And all while your captor watched, taking perverse satisfaction in your suffering. Gu's cruelty reached a horrifying new level when he ordered Moses' fingernails crushed in a vise and his toenails hammered off. These punishments were not random acts of rage, but calculated measures to terrorize, to send a message not only to Moses, but to every enslaved person who might dare to defy. The pain of losing fingernails and toenails is unimaginable to most. It's a slow, excruciating agony that doesn't just cause physical suffering, but destroys the ability to perform simple tasks and leaves a permanent mark. Yet, through this mutilation, Moses' spirit still refused to break. Gu's actions reveal the terrifying logic of slavery's cruelty. This was not about justice or discipline in any fair sense. It was about control, power, and fear. Each punishment was designed to dehumanize, to remind enslaved people that their bodies belonged not to themselves but to their owners. The system depended on breaking minds as well as bodies. For children like Moses, this brutality was especially cruel. The goal was not just to discipline, but to crush any seed of hope or rebellion before it could grow. Moses' story, though extreme, was not unique. Across the South, enslaved people faced a relentless regime of terror. Pregnant women endured lashings with holes dug so unborn children wouldn't be harmed, a cold calculus ensuring the plantation's workforce would continue to grow. Children were beaten for the smallest offenses, sometimes publicly humiliated as warnings to others. Punishments were often public spectacles, designed to sow fear and submission in the entire enslaved community. Yet, amidst this brutality, enslaved people found ways to resist, small acts of defiance that kept hope alive. Some sang spirituals that carried coded messages of escape and freedom. Others sabotaged equipment, slowed work, or simply survived in secret acts of rebellion. Moses, though a child, embodied this spirit. His attempts to run, his refusal to submit quietly, were acts of courage that defied the overwhelming odds. The psychological damage inflicted by these tortures was as severe as the physical. Fear was weaponized to isolate enslaved people, making community and trust difficult. The mutilations and humiliations created trauma that lasted lifetimes, passed down through generations. The cruelty Moses Roer faced was meant to extinguish every flicker of hope, every desperate desire to be free. Yet, with every lash, every iron chain, every mutilation, his resolve only grew stronger. Moses was no longer just a boy. He was a symbol of resistance, a living threat to the system that sought to own him. Moses' earliest escape attempts were born of pure desperation. The daily horrors, torture, exhaustion, fear, became unbearable. For a child whose body had been broken and soul battered, the possibility of freedom was worth every risk. But escaping was no simple matter. Plantations were fortified with fences, patrolled by overseers and dogs, and surrounded by hostile terrain. The enslaved had no maps, no supplies, and every step outside the boundary was a step into deadly uncertainty. Still, Moses tried. Each time Moses fled, the consequences grew more severe. When he was caught after his first escape, John Goo's punishments escalated from brutal lashings to the terrifying use of the cotton screw and iron shackles. Every failed attempt was met with increased brutality, yet Moses's will remained unbroken. Moses's repeated escapes did not only endanger him. They sent shockwaves through the enslaved community, raising fears of collective punishment. Slave owners and overseers used these events to justify crackdowns, more patrols, more brutal whippings, more public executions. The cost of one person's resistance often meant suffering for many. Yet, Moses's courage inspired others. His story spread quietly through whispers, a beacon for those desperate for hope. In the heart of this terror, family ties and small acts of kindness offered fragile lifelines. Moses's mother, though powerless against the brutality, did everything she could to shield him emotionally. She whispered prayers, brought small comforts, and told stories of strength and survival. Among the enslaved, there were those who quietly aided escape attempts, sharing food, warning of patrols, and offering hiding places. These acts of solidarity, though small, were revolutionary. One of the darkest moments of Moses's captivity was his suspension in the cotton screw after an escape attempt. This horrific device, normally used to compress cotton bales, became a tool of torture and psychological terror. Suspending Moses by his wrists, bent iron shackles around his feet, Gu inflicted unimaginable pain designed not just to punish but to send a chilling warning to all. The cotton screw squeezed tightly, cutting off circulation, contorting Moses's body into agonizing positions. Hours stretched endlessly, muscles burned, and the mind teetered on the brink of collapse. Yet, Moses's spirit refused to break. The decision to crush Moses's fingernails was both physical and symbolic. Fingernails allow humans to grasp, scratch, defend, and express. Destroying them was a way to strip away autonomy, to rob Moses of even the smallest tools of resistance. The vice-crushing left Moses incapacitated, unable to perform even simple tasks without searing pain. This act of cruelty shocked many around him, deepening the silence of fear but never the silence of hope. John Goo's relentless tortures were part of a broader strategy, terrorized not just the individual, but the entire enslaved community. Public punishments, mutilations, and threats served as warnings. They enforced the idea that resistance was futile and that total submission was the only path to survival. Yet, this psychological warfare also sparked defiance. For Moses, every brutal punishment was fuel for his desire to escape. Every lash and chain was a reminder of the injustice he refused to accept. As Moses's attempts continued, John Gu and other slaveholders grew paranoid. Security increased, patrols intensified, dogs were trained to hunt escapees, fences were reinforced. Yet, these measures only highlighted the terror that resistance could inspire, the power it held to threaten a system built on fear. Through every punishment, every mutilation, every brutal night chained on the cold earth, Moses's resolve hardened. Why would a man crush a child's fingers with a vice? Why would he suspend that child from a cotton screw, tear off his fingernails, and whip his mutilated body until it bled? What kind of system demands that level of violence? Not just once, but repeatedly, systematically? The answer is chilling, yet necessary to confront. Because slavery wasn't just about labor. It was about absolute control. And cruelty, unthinkable, precise, and targeted, was its most effective tool. Slavery in the American South was not merely an economic system. It was an empire of fear. To keep millions of people in bondage, to force human beings to harvest cotton, sugar, rice, and tobacco under the whip, required more than chains and manacles. It required psychological warfare. It required the crushing of the spirit. Every lash, Every mutilation, every public whipping was calculated. These weren't random acts of sadism. They were deliberate performances of dominance. Rituals of terror designed to send one clear message. You are not human. You are property. And any hint of resistance will be met with pain. In 1852, a formerly enslaved man named Lewis Clark gave a chilling account of how punishments were applied on the plantation where he grew up. He said, "They would whip us in the morning to make us go faster, and whip us at night to remind us what would happen if we didn't." Pain became a scheduling tool. Torture became a management strategy. Slaveholders like John Gu weren't just angry or unhinged. They were strategic. They knew that terror was more efficient than persuasion. That a man who fears for his life will plow harder. That a woman who has seen her child beaten will work without pause. Punishment wasn't about justice. It was about submission. Moses Roer's story shows the brutal logic of the system. Destroy the body to control the mind. His crushed fingers weren't just a punishment. They were a message. Don't ever think about touching freedom again. His suspension from the cotton screw was more than torture. It was a display. An object lesson for every other enslaved child watching. This is what happens when you dream too loudly. It was the plantation equivalent of a public execution. A warning carved into flesh. Nowhere was slavery's cruelty more diabolical than in how it treated pregnant women and families. The pregnant body, sacred in most societies, was not spared under American chattel slavery. Enslaved women were whipped, even while carrying children in their wombs. In one documented method, described by both Frederick Douglass and abolitionist Lydia Child, women were forced to lay face down in a shallow pit dug in the ground. This was done to protect the unborn child from being crushed while the mother was whipped mercilessly. But the real reason wasn't mercy. It was economy. Enslaved children were valuable property. They were future labor, future capital. Slaveholders wanted them born, but they didn't care how the mothers suffered to get them there. And so pregnant women worked in the fields until the moment of delivery. They birthed children in dirt floor cabins, often without a midwife, and were sent back to the fields within days. One enslaved woman in Georgia recounted, "I had 6 children, and I went to the field the next day after every one of them. The overseer said, 'You're just another mule. Get back.'" This was not just physical abuse. It was a system designed to sever the maternal bond, to deny black women the dignity of motherhood, and to ensure that even children entered this world under domination. The family unit, one of the most powerful sources of resilience and culture, was slavery's greatest threat. That's why slaveholders systematically dismantled it. Children were sold away from mothers, husbands from wives, siblings torn apart like livestock. The emotional devastation was immeasurable. In his 1845 narrative, Frederick Douglass wrote, "I never saw my mother, to know her as such, more than 4 or 5 times in my life. She died when I was about 7 years old, and I had no idea of the place of her burial." This was by design. Slaveholders knew that love made people defiant, that a man might run to see his wife, that a mother might shield her son. So they crushed the family before it could form, kept people isolated, broken, afraid. And when someone like Moses defied that fear, the entire plantation trembled. Slavery didn't just brutalize individuals, it traumatized entire communities. Every public punishment was a group spectacle. Overseers forced children to watch their parents whipped. Women were stripped naked in front of crowds. The screams of the tortured echoed through the fields, haunting those who hadn't yet been punished. It was generational trauma in real time. A formerly enslaved woman named Harriet Jacobs described how children lived in constant dread. There is something akin to horror in the thought of children being born into such a life, and it is painful to remember that I was once a child there, free in heart, yet chained in body. This fear was the glue that held slavery together. But it never quite worked the way they hoped. Because even in the most horrific conditions, people like Moses Roer resisted. Not just by running, but by remembering, by speaking, by surviving. The stories of this cruelty survive not because slaveholders recorded them, but because enslaved people did. The Federal Writers Project of the 1930s interviewed thousands of formerly enslaved men and women. Their voices, though elderly at the time, still carried the raw scars of slavery. One man, Henry James, recounted, "They beat my daddy so bad, He couldn't walk for 2 weeks. They say he looked a white man in the eyes. They say that was uppity. Another, Sarah Gudger, said, I never know what peace was till I was old. When I was young, it was whip after whip. Crying never helped. These testimonies form a record no plantation journal ever would. Because cruelty was efficient. Because pain produced compliance. Because fear made profit. But above all, because recognizing the humanity of enslaved people would have unraveled the whole system. If Moses Roer had been seen as a boy, rather than property, how could John Gu live with himself? If pregnant women were treated as mothers, not machines, how could anyone justify the cotton industry? To admit humanity would be to admit guilt. So instead, they used terror to silence the truth. But Moses couldn't be silenced, and neither could the millions like him who survived long enough to tell their stories. Every scar Moses bore was a record. Every escape attempt was an indictment. Every cry from the cotton screw, from the whip, from the broken families. That was the real history of America's wealth. Not just industry and innovation, but brutality and blood. The cruelty of slavery was not a side effect. It was the engine. It maintained order. It maximized profit. It built empires. And yet, the human spirit outlived it. Imagine waking up each day in a world where your body isn't your own, where your thoughts are monitored, your language forbidden, and your pain considered profit. This was not the exception. It was the norm. What follows are 15 common, yet horrifying practices that enslaved black people in America endured, not in secret, but openly, as law, as culture, as business. These weren't isolated evils. They were policy. 1. Iron muzzles and face masks. Enslaved people who spoke out, prayed too loudly, or dared to eat without permission were often fitted with iron muzzles. Heavy masks bolted to the face, with metal bits forced into the mouth. The goal? Silence. Humiliation. Starvation. In South Carolina, a woman named Hannah was punished with such a device after being accused of talking back. She could neither eat solid food nor speak to her children for days. The muzzle wasn't just torture. It was a declaration. We control your voice. 2. Branding with hot irons. Just like livestock, enslaved people were branded with letters representing their owners. The marks were usually burned into the skin of the chest, back, or even face. Thomas Jefferson, yes, that Jefferson, authorized branding of runaways on multiple occasions. One runaway ad from 1806 read, branded on the cheek with the letter R, reward offered for return. Imagine being permanently marked, so anyone who saw you would know. You try to be free. 3. Whipping posts and lash trees. The whipping post was not a punishment of last resort. It was a daily ritual. Men, women, and children were stripped, tied down, and whipped with rawhide, bullwhips, or cat-o'-nine-tails. Some overseers dipped the lashes in brine afterward, to clean the wounds, they claimed. But the truth? It just intensified the agony. Henry Bibb, an escaped enslaved man, remembered being whipped so severely that he passed out. And when he came to, they whip him again. 4. Amputation for escape attempts. Trying to escape was not just a gamble. It was a sentence. Runaways who were caught faced mutilation. Hands, toes, even feet were chopped off, not as punishment but as deterrence. In Louisiana, records show that repeat escapees were legally subject to having their ears cropped or Achilles tendon severed. Imagine living every day knowing freedom could cost you a limb. 5. Torture devices hidden in plain sight. Plantations often kept iron collars with spikes, shackles with razor edges, and Negro paddles, embedded with nails or glass. These weren't secret tools. They were standard issue. Abolitionist Theodore Weld described visiting a plantation where dozens of such devices hung in a shed, like butcher's tools. This was the architecture of fear. 6. Sexual abuse of women and girls. One of slavery's most sinister realities was the institutionalized rape of black women and girls. From adolescence, enslaved women were seen as breeders. Owners used them to create more enslaved labor. Rape was not punished. It was protected under law. Harriet Jacobs, who escaped slavery, wrote, "No matter how much I struggled, he came at night, and there was no door I could close that he could not open." Thousands of mixed-race children were born from this violence. Many were then enslaved by their own fathers. 7. Forced breeding of enslaved people. Slavery wasn't just about labor. It was about reproduction. Enslaved men and women were often forced to mate, like animals, to produce more children for sale. This wasn't occasional. It was planned and tracked, with stud men selected based on strength and women based on fertility. No consent, no intimacy, just genetic capitalism. 8. Child labor as early as age 3. Children as young as 3 years old were made to carry water, shoo flies, or sweep cabins. By age 7, most were working in the fields for 10 to 12 hours a day. If they cried, whipped. If they played, beaten. In one 1850 account, an enslaved boy named Samuel was whipped until unconscious for spilling a jug of milk. They were denied childhood. Their only toys were tools and trauma. 9. Family separation by design. At any moment, a child could be sold away. A mother could be traded. A husband could vanish. These weren't tragedies. They were transactions. Auctions advertised entire families like furniture. One strong man, one breeding woman, 3 pickaninny children. Estimates suggest over 1/3 of enslaved marriages were destroyed by sale. Love was dangerous under slavery because love meant vulnerability. 10. No legal right to marry or raise children. Black people under slavery could not legally marry, and their children were not theirs. If a child was born, it belonged, by law, to the owner of the mother. Slave codes made it clear. The child follows the condition of the mother. This meant any bond could be broken. Any moment could be your last as a family. 11. Starvation diets and denied health care. Enslaved people were often fed once a day, usually with cornmeal, fatback, or leftover scraps unfit for white tables. Health care? Only enough to keep them working. If someone became too ill to labor, they were often left to die, or sold as defective. Slavery wasn't just cruel. It was calculated neglect. 12. Language suppression and forced illiteracy. Enslaved Africans were stripped of their native languages, and any attempt to learn to read or write English was a crime. In South Carolina and Georgia, laws banned teaching enslaved people to read. The penalty? Fines, imprisonment, or worse. They feared literacy because reading led to knowledge. Knowledge led to rebellion. Frederick Douglass said it best. Once you learn to read, you will be forever free. So they banned it. 13. Sleep deprivation and overwork. Many enslaved people labored from before sunrise to well after dark. After that, they still had to tend their own gardens, patch clothes, or care for children. Some survived on 3 to 4 hours of sleep per night. Sleep wasn't a right. It was a privilege, earned only by perfect obedience. 14. Constant surveillance and informants. Plantations used fear not just from overseers, but from each other. Some enslaved people were forced to spy on others, reporting escape attempts or rebellious talk. Punishment for disobedience was often carried out in front of others. This system of internal distrust kept people isolated, even while surrounded. 15. Psychological terror and religious manipulation. Slavery didn't just break the body. It targeted the soul. Enslavers used religion as a weapon, preaching obedience and quoting scripture like chains. Verses like, "Slaves, obey your masters," were carved into sermons, even into slave cabins. At the same time, enslaved people who dared to hold secret prayer meetings, hush harbors hidden in the woods, faced brutal punishments if caught. But they kept singing. They kept praying, because faith was one of the few things that slavery couldn't fully erase. These weren't rare horrors. They were routine, codified, justified, normalized. For over 250 years, the American South, and much of the North, depended on this daily terror. It wasn't just cotton or sugar or tobacco that built empires. It was human flesh. It was family torn from family, silence enforced by steel, and pain treated as profit. Remember these 15 horrors not as footnotes in a history book, but as echoes that still haunt this land. Because when cruelty becomes normal, resistance becomes sacred. Imagine a house built on blood-soaked ground, a nation constructed from cotton, but mortared with misery. Now ask yourself, if slavery ended in 1865, why are the prophets still here? Welcome to the truth they don't want taught in schools. Slavery didn't just happen. It was the economic engine behind the richest empire the world had ever seen. Slavery was not a Southern mistake. It was America's first corporate enterprise, and it built more wealth than Wall Street dares to admit. Cotton was king, and black bodies were the throne. In 1860, just before the Civil War, cotton made up 60% of America's total exports. 60%. Let that sit for a second. The United States wasn't known for technology, industry, or democracy. It was known for enslaved labor that powered cotton fields from Mississippi to Georgia. One crop, one region, and one race force to make it happen. Economist Edward Baptist, in his landmark book, The Half Has Never Been Told, estimated that the unpaid labor of enslaved people created over $3 billion in profit for enslavers. That's in 19th century dollars. Today, that's the equivalent of hundreds of billions. But it didn't stop at the South. Northern banks, Southern whips. Here's the part they never teach you. Northern banks funded slavery. J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Citibank have all admitted their institutions either directly loaned money to enslavers or accepted human beings as collateral. That's right, a man, woman, or child used as collateral for a loan. When that enslaver defaulted, the banks seized the person. Imagine your mortgage lender repossessing your cousin. That's how deep the dehumanization went. In cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, textile mills ran on Southern cotton. Insurance companies like Aetna and New York Life wrote life insurance policies on enslaved people, but only paid out if the person died while working. Let that sink in. If an enslaved man drowned in a river while hauling cotton, his owner got a payout. His family, nothing. The financial capital of the world wasn't born clean. Wall Street, yes, that Wall Street, was once the site of New York's slave market. From 1711 to the early 1800s, enslaved people were auctioned just steps away from where the New York Stock Exchange now stands. And after slavery became less visible in the North, the money didn't stop. Instead, Northern financiers invested in slavery from afar, reaping dividends while others wielded the whip. Even Ivy League schools got their cut. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Brown all have documented histories of benefiting from slavery. Brown University released a report in 2006 admitting the school's founder was a major slave trader. Harvard recently disclosed that over 70 prominent donors and faculty were tied to the slave economy. But these institutions weren't anomalies. They were part of a nationwide system that treated enslaved labor as the foundation of civilization. Plantation profits paid for railroads, funded universities, built shipping empires, and even helped finance the U.S. government. That's right. U.S. Treasury records show that taxes and duties from slave-grown exports like cotton and sugar made up as much as 50% of federal revenue before the Civil War. The government ran on slavery. Literally. By 1860, 4 million enslaved black people were worth more than all the banks, railroads, and factories in the U.S. combined. Read that again. Black flesh was the economy. The average price of a young man in peak labor years, $1,200. That's more than $40,000 today. Enslaved women of childbearing age were sold at premiums. Children were bought as investments. People were bought for their potential to suffer. One enslaver bragged in his records that he was doubling his wealth each year, not through land, but through breeding. This wasn't just evil. It was enterprise. You've heard the line, most Southerners didn't own slaves. True, but deeply misleading. The Southern economy revolved around slavery, even for those who owned none. Poor white farmers couldn't compete with massive plantations using free labor. Many aspired to own slaves themselves one day. It was considered the mark of success. Slavery gave them a racial ladder to stand on, even while they remained in poverty. And politically, they voted to protect it, die for it, and fight for it, because they believed white skin alone made them superior. The result? A society willing to destroy itself in a civil war rather than lose its grip on the whip. When slavery ended in 1865, there were no reparations for the formerly enslaved. But guess who did get paid? Slave owners. In Washington, D.C., the government paid over $1 million in compensation to enslavers for the loss of their property. One man was paid for the freedom of 70 people. The people themselves received nothing. Freed black families started life with no land, no money, and no legal protections, while the plantation class kept their homes, wealth, and political power. That imbalance never corrected itself. It just evolved. Slavery's end did not mean the end of exploitation. It morphed into sharecropping, convict leasing, Jim Crow, redlining, and today, the racial wealth gap that remains as wide as ever. In 2023, the average white family in America held 8 times the wealth of the average black family. How did that gap form? It began in the cotton fields. It continued in the counting rooms. And it still casts a shadow today. Slavery was not a Southern sin. It was a national investment strategy. It powered factories, launched banks, enriched universities, and financed governments. Its profits were passed down through generations, converted into homes, stocks, land, and legacies. And yet, its victims were erased, their labor unpaid, their names forgotten. But not anymore. Because the truth is not just painful, it's necessary. To heal, we must first remember. To rise, we must first reckon. Slavery didn't just build America. Slavery is America's foundation. Long after the scars faded, Moses Roer carried something the whip couldn't touch: his dignity. He was a man the world was never meant to know. A survivor of a system built to destroy his body, his mind, and his legacy. But here we are, still speaking his name. That is resistance. He fought the only way he could, by refusing to give in. Every day he woke up in chains and chose to live. He defied the system that said he was nothing. Every whispered prayer, every silent tear, every stolen moment of hope was a revolution in its own right. And when the day finally came, when Moses walked away from that plantation, bones weak but heart strong, he didn't just leave with freedom. He left with truth. A truth he passed down, not in textbooks, but in stories. Not in museums, but in memory. Moses didn't have a monument. He had his children's eyes, their stories, and now ours. We were never supposed to hear about Moses Roer. His story, like so many others, was buried under layers of textbook lies and patriotic myth-making. They taught us slavery was a necessary evil, that it civilized the enslaved, that it ended peacefully. But what they left out was the sound of cracking whips, the smell of burning flesh, and the cries of children torn from their mothers. They erased names like Moses's to protect the reputation of the enslavers. They sanitized the horror so America could pretend to be innocent. But silence is not neutrality. It's complicity. Moses Roer isn't just a name from the past. He's a mirror for the present. In every unjust sentence handed down in courtrooms today, in every black child denied their full history in school, in every system built on exploitation and silence, his story reminds us that freedom is never handed over. It's wrestled from the hands of the powerful by people who refuse to stop fighting, even when they're alone, even when no one is watching. His legacy lives on in every movement for justice, every truth teller, every soul brave enough to ask, what really happened? So now, the question turns to us. What will we do with Moses' story? Will we scroll past it, forget it, pretend it never happened? Or will we say his name? Will we teach our children that real heroes didn't always wear medals or ride in parades, but sometimes limped through back roads with lash marks on their backs and songs of freedom in their hearts? Will we demand that history be told in full, not filtered through comfort, but drenched in truth? Because the fight isn't over. It continues in classrooms, on ballots, in policies, and in the hearts of those who dare to remember.